Welcome. Hola. Bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Connie Guerrero. Welcome to Community Talk. Bienvenidos a Hablando en Comunidad. Mi nombre es Connie Guerrero. Aquí estoy con Rudy Espinosa Murray. Hola, Rudy.
¿Qué tal, Connie? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, muy bien. ¿Y tú cómo estás?
Bien, bien. Aquí un poco preocupado con todas las cosas que están pasando en el país, ¿no? It's a very difficult time for the country that, we're dealing with so many issues right now.
Así es, difícil, un poquito difícil los tiempos que estamos pasando por mucha violencia que está afectando nuestra comunidad. And yes, today we have a couple very difficult subjects that we're going to be talking about, but we have people that are going to be joining us that have a lot of information about the history here locally and just a lot of thoughts that they're going to be sharing with us. So let's go ahead and introduce our guests. What do you think, Rudy?
Of course. We have two very special guests. They are API leaders in the community of San Mateo County. Virginia Chencarelli, who's president of the Harbor District, San Mateo Harbor District, and Jeff G., council member of Redwood City. And we're happy to have them here to talk about a couple different things. One, about the history of hate against Asians, right? That really stems from the Bay Area. Then we talk about the issues of gun violence that we experienced against Asian Americans in Atlanta, Georgia, and then seeing some of the issues in Boulder, Colorado. And also we want to talk about their experiences as members of the API community and how they've experienced, growing up in a country where Asian hate has been in existence since the founding of our country. So welcome.
Thank you,
Rudy. Thank you, Rudy. Thank you, Connie. It's great to see you, Virginia.
Good to see you too, Jeff. Thanks, Rudy and Connie, for having us on your show to talk about just a difficult topic, but also a very sensitive topic, right? That's just fraught with so many sub-issues and sub-contexts.
Yeah. So the first question, can you both share a little bit about the history of the United States? Because I feel like a lot of us aren't taught, at least in public school education, the history and how the United States actually had laws that were created to discriminate and to block Asians from coming into the country. We saw issues during the World War II where Japanese Americans were put into internment camps. And so all across, American history, at least from the founding of European settlers, we've seen this Asian hate. So can y'all share a little bit about that?
Sure. Virginia, you want to start?
Sure. So, as you said, throughout American history, Asians, have had a different place, I think, in society. And, starting with the Page Act that, kind of made it difficult for free labor, people who would provide free labor and, for immoral purposes, to come over here. And that act, the Page Act of 1875, was actually geared towards or enforced against Chinese people specifically. And then a follow-on act, which is the only federal legislation to this day in American history, was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted in 1882, which excluded Chinese immigrants and Chinese workers from, being part of this country. So it's not like this is a new thing in American history and even in California, because a lot of this started in California during the time when there was this Asian or anti-Chinese, hysteria that was kind of going across the country. But if you put it into context in American history at the time, we were also dealing with the end of the Civil War, like 20 years out, 10 years out of 1875, and then another 7 years, and then emancipation. So, the history of different communities of color are kind of intertwined here. And, this is just one context of a larger picture situation.
Virginia, it's great to get that quick summary of some of the history, because this is not new, as you shared, Rudy. And when you talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, California was the first state to sign on with that law, and then went east. And in a meeting that I was in Saturday with a number of other API elected officials, the comment was made that this is an old story. It has gone on for years, and we really need to stop writing new chapters in that old book. We need to start a new book and start all over to really work together as a larger community, not just the API community, but we really need to work together to really make our society much better here. Because what we're talking about, why we are in the spotlight right now, last year it was a different community. The year before was a different one. The history here in California is so intertwined, as you said, Virginia. We really got to work together to start over.
And I would add that if you look at history, we don't want history to repeat itself. So the way I look at this is, how do we work together, all of us as a society and all communities of color, including the white community, right? Because white is still a color. But, our goal should be as a society is to stop the cycle of racism, just like we are, we have a desire to stop the cycle of poverty. This is no different.
One of the more local aspects of what we've gone through here is we talked before the program started about Tan Fran. Before the shopping center, there was the racetrack, but the racetrack was there and then temporarily served as an intern processing center for the Japanese Americans on the way to internment camps. That history can't be repeated because at that moment it was the Japanese Americans. Given the rhetoric that we've heard over the last several years, it could be another community. We have to learn from our history, and so that we don't repeat it.
Yeah,
Not only can it shouldn't be repeated, it needs to be out because unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, I think Asians have a reputation for not speaking out as much. And I think this is our moment. It's kind of like the George Floyd moment. So what is the opportunity that we have as a society to work together to, as I said, in this cycle of racism?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that we need to do, right, is acknowledge our history. We can't move forward if we don't understand the context in which we live in. And sadly, I believe that most people don't know the long history against Asians in this country, and what coupled with a culture that has been quiet for a long time, right? When we, like, as you were mentioning, Virginia, it's a culture that's been kind of heads down and quiet, and this is the moment, right, for people to speak out and those voices to be raised. So I want to take this into another step because I feel like, and one of the things that I've seen is, and I don't know if y'all heard the term, but like allyship, right? Like we have people in power, we have white folks in power that we think are our allies most of the time, or we feel that they are. But sometimes that allyship is only performative. And what that means is like, it comes out of their mouth, but it's not happening through actions, right? And a lot of times people think that it's with regards to issues that are overt, right? Overt racism. Like that's the things that we want people to stand up for, right? But it goes beyond that. As we think about what history we're being taught in schools, what support we're giving to women and people of color when it comes to jobs, when it comes to elections, when it comes to access to healthcare. So the issues go deeper than just being attacked or not attacked on the street. Do we actually have allies? And if we don't, how do we get them to actually be real allies, to switch from being performative allies to true allies? So what do y'all think about that? And what have y'all seen? And what do you think are some ways in that we can push our allies to be true allies?
So I think this term performative allyship, I think needs to also be brought in with the conversation of commandeering a discussion on racism, right? I mean, I recently had a city council member from one of the jurisdictions in the fire district. I'm also on the Menlo Park Fire Protection District Board, who was basically talking to me about how the fire service, or in our district in particular, we didn't have a lot of women firefighters, which is true. But I also, I think the bigger problem was that there's a racial problem, a racial diversity problem in the fire service. I think that's more of a concern to me than the gender inequality, just because I think most women, may not want to do the job of a firefighter. So if you look at our administrative side, we have more women. There's almost all women. So, they're professionally able to grow. But the thing that was interesting about it was that this person who's on the city council was lecturing me about this. And I'm like, well, look at your own, and I'm not just saying him, but any elected official should be looking at their own organizations and seeing, well, how diverse is your organization before you start talking about other people's, right? And so, if you have this, what I would call this implicit bias, it's like, do you realize you're talking to a woman of color about this issue, right? And it's like, look at your own organization as well. And it's not to be, not to try to put someone down, but I think in general, the big picture lesson here is before people kind of do what they do, they should really take stock of their own situation, their own implicit biases, their own tacit racism, or whatever you want to call it, right? And don't sit there and say, oh, I support women and people of color, when you're not endorsing a candidate who's a woman of color, or you're not endorsing a person of color, but you want my help to help you, which I'm happy to do, for example, right? But I'm just saying that people need to take stock of their own internal temperature and say, gosh, where am I? And how do I really want to support somebody, right?
Well,
Who's a woman of color?
Racism is on the spectrum, right? People don't realize that racism is on a spectrum. It's not like overt, I'm going to attack people of color on the street, but it also is reflected or projected in what we say and what we do or what we don't do, right? When it comes to hiring practices, endorsement practices, as you mentioned, support for different issues or lack of support, or being quiet on certain issues. There are varying degrees of racism, and first we need to acknowledge that, right? That you're not, like, you can be racist and not be beating up somebody of color on the street. That's not the only thing that makes you racist. But if you are benefiting from a system of white supremacy and you have privilege and you don't acknowledge that, but you continue to take advantage of the system, in a sense, you are practicing racism, right? Because you are benefiting because of the oppression of people of color in any given way, any. So that's the stuff that I think we need to talk about more, because I don't think enough people realize that. And then we enter into the conversation about white fragility and people getting uncomfortable and having that conversation, which is probably for another talk. But if white people that are listening right now, if you don't feel uncomfortable about something even a little bit, then we aren't combating the problems, because white people in general are benefiting from white supremacy. So you're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that is okay. And sorry, I didn't mean to stray in that direction. But now let's talk about the intersection of gun violence and hate and racism, because we just saw that last week. Any thoughts? Any reactions to that?
Let me start, then I know Virginia can share. This is just the typical progression. First it's conflicting conversations, then it's anger, then hate, and then ultimately it becomes violence. And that's what we're seeing locally, not necessarily with the gun violence yet, but the attacks on the seniors in the Asian community. When people feel that they can't do anything about it, they look for someone to take their hate out on and anger out on, and it manifests itself in violence. And it's very sad. We need to break the stereotype of being the model minority and speak up and raise our voices and stop the escalation and find common ground on how we can work together. Ultimately, though, in some cases, people decide to do more, and with the ease of obtaining guns and other things, we have seen 2 incidences across the country in less than a week in mass shootings, and we need to stop that. We need to stop that violence from escalating and turn the dial back down. So I'll turn it over to Virginia.
Well, so Rudy, you know that I'm actually a survivor of gun violence. My eighth grade English teacher was shot and killed in the classroom about 45 years ago. So these mass shootings or school shootings, I mean anything like that, just is very troubling to me. But I think what was most troubling to me with the Atlanta shooting was that the shooter really looked, I think he objectified Asian women. And I mean, obviously it's speculation, but when you are trying to remove temptation because you are a self-proclaimed sex addict, you know, what does that mean? Does that mean that you didn't see these Asian women who were shot as moms and as people, as working women? And so, as Jeff said, is if something like this becomes, you know, deadly or violent, it actually, in this case, it has become deadly. And as an Asian woman, I'm Chinese American, who has, you know, been in public life and in public office. You know, I've actually experienced some of this objectification in public emails where, you know, I've been characterized as, you know, a woman who, you know, will use her body and her red lipstick, you know, to influence support and votes. And I'm kind of clever in a reptilian way, you know, to kind of, it's almost like there's this weird analogy or connection to this dragon lady kind of, you know, representation, which is completely wrong. And, you know, that's really uncalled for. But this is a very complex issue. But as long as gun violence exists and this kind of anti-Asian sentiment is out there, this Asian hate is out there, you know, and then the possible objectification of Asian women, it's a very bad combination and it's a very dangerous combination. But again, you know, like I said, this is, you know, the gun violence is not just within the Asian community, and it's going to take the entire society, all of us, to really, you know, break. I think when we break the cycle of racism, we will curb gun violence. I know that right now there is this legislation with Moms Demand Action that I'm kind of helping with in Menlo Park, and I know that other cities in San Mateo County have signed on, which is this, what is it, the safe storage of guns. And I can't help but think that 45 years ago, if my classmate had, you know, didn't have easy access to a gun, that our teacher would still be alive.
Oh, thank you so much, Virginia, for sharing that story. It's really, really, you know, touching what you shared about your personal people, you know, talking about you and just the comments that they make, because they really do hurt, you know, they really do. You know, people are sensitive. You know, we are, we're human. So,
But Connie, you know what? At the end of the day, we serve the public. You do a lot of work. Rudy does a lot of work. Jeff does, you know, I know he does a ton of work. We serve the public and we do it because we know we can make our communities better. And by making our communities better individually, you know, hopefully we'll be able to make society better. And again, you know, unify and just break this cycle of racism.
correct. Yes,
We're not
absolutely.
victims, Connie.
Right. Exactly. No, we're not. But yes, thank you for sharing that. And also with regards to the gun violence, I mean, you know, every time there's a violent act, it's like we think, you know, how many more of these incidents is it going to take for, you know, for there to be really some action? You know, it's just so sad hearing about all the stories and people that, you know, get shot because of, you know, access to guns. And I mean, I just think it's very sad.
Connie, you know, in 25 years, we have not seen any significant legislation come out of our federal government. 25 years, we have not seen any significant legislation on guns, and there is broad support for common sense gun laws like universal background checks or red flag laws. And if we estimate the number of people that have died because of gun violence in the last 25 years, that's 1 million people. 1 million people. Because we lose 40,000 people every year because of a gun. Their lives are taken every single year. Gun suicide, city gun violence, mass shootings. 1 million people. It is just absurd. Connie, you're right. It's like, how many more incidents do we have to wait for? It's like, it goes up. We have a news cycle, right? We talk about it. Everyone's angry, fists up. And then the news cycle dies down, and there goes the conversation on ending gun violence. And it's quite tiring, actually. That it's just this like it's always just cyclical, right? It's like we talk about it, then we don't talk about it. We talk about it, then we don't talk about it. Our Congress, and I'm going to be very specific here, our Republican Congress right now, because even Democrats used to be very quiet about gun violence in the past, right? About passing gun sense legislation. Now they're not. Now most are outspoken about it. The rhetoric has changed. The narrative has changed. But because the NRA has such a hold on our Republican senators and House Republicans, nothing can move forward. I mean, Mitch McConnell was talking about, oh, none of that stuff is going to do anything. It's all about mental health. And he's wrong. And it keeps happening, right? So, Connie, you're 100% right. 100% right.
So Rudy and Connie, Virginia, at least Virginia knows me. I'm not a fan of raising taxes. But, the natural reaction is gun control when we ever see a mass shooting or gun violence. A thought that I've tried to circulate, at least socialize, is that we've seen taxes on cigarettes to fight cancer and tobacco awareness. We've seen taxes on soda for obesity. Isn't it time to start talking about maybe taxes on gun ammunition for mental health so that we can do more education and get the resources where they're needed? If we can't do gun control because of the national dialogue and the votes, I think there's enough votes out there maybe to say, let's get more mental health resources out there and pay it through some additional taxes, because we do it on these other things I just mentioned.
Yeah, the problem is so complicated that not one action is going to solve it, right? It's not all just mental health. It's not all easy access to guns. It's not all there are multiple variables, and you have to attack it from all sides, right? You have to, and you're proposing an idea. Safe gun storage, as Virginia's talking about what's happening in Menlo Park. That's another idea. 1,000 kids die every year, 1,000 kids, because their parents left guns out, or they went to a family member's house and the guns were out, or they had access to them and they accidentally shot themselves or someone else. 1,000 kids. Think about it. If we had laws that said you have to keep your gun in a safe, maybe we'd have 1,000 children that didn't die every year, right? So there are different issues to it. Red flag laws. If a family member or someone is unstable and can hurt themselves or others, and they own a gun, you have a route to get that gun out of their hands temporarily until that person is stable again, right? So we can still respect the Second Amendment, but there's possibilities of common sense legislation so that we can attack the problem from different sides, because there are different causes of it. So, we just need to stop this. It's almost like we get presented these false choices from Congress, like it's one or the other, or it's all this or all that, and it's not any of those things. It's a plethora of things, right, that we have to act on before we can start curbing gun violence for real. I mean,
but it's a complicated issue, Rudy. It's a complicated issue because there's the black market also. So maybe it's a tax thing on guns. I mean, Jeff, I think it's a great idea. And if there's always been this talk that there's not enough funding for mental health intervention or help, right? How do we fund that? Maybe that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
It's at least an idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want my taxes to go to that, Jeff.
Which, by the way, Councilmember G, it's like Redwood City took action, right? Redwood City implemented a safe gun storage ordinance, and that was important because it actually went above what the state requires. The state had a lower minimum, right? The state only required if you had someone who was 18 or younger in the house. And now in Redwood City, it's like every gun owner has to have their gun stored. So it does do more, and hopefully the state is also going to be changing that.
But you know what, Rudy, it takes courage too for elected leaders to do that. The safe gun storage ordinance that was in front of the Menlo Park City Council a year ago passed the first time, and then on its second reading, it didn't pass. So, you know, I don't know what happened, but it takes courage and leadership to pass something like that. My understanding was they were afraid, the council was afraid that the city would be sued. You know, but the other cities like Redwood City and even South San Francisco have passed these ordinances.
But that's about priorities, right? Like, you're worried about being sued, but shouldn't you be worried about lives that that's going to save? Isn't that the concern, right? Like, could you imagine if a child had taken a gun and accidentally shot themselves or someone else?
Well, in my classmate actually took his father's guns, walked down the hill, went into the classroom, shot my teacher. Thankfully, he didn't shoot anyone else, and left. You know, so, you know, again, it's going to take leadership and courage. And that's where elected officials must step up if they are in a position to do so.
Yeah.
Agree. Virginia, I think, you know, you said it. I think it's, you know, the courage and the leadership from all these elected officials to actually make some change and, you know, within our communities on various different topics. I mean, today we covered a lot of different topics in our community. And I think that's, you know, kind of, it does come down to courage and leadership from our elected officials and actually doing the right thing on these various different topics. So I don't know, Rudy, but you know, I kind of want to know, like we talked a little bit earlier about working together. And I kind of want to know, you know, how can our Latinx community and our Asian community, what can we do to, you know, maybe work together and really create some change in San Mateo County?
Yeah, Connie, that's a great topic, because we do have to work together. And what I tell everybody is, number one, you know, our communities keep score. They see who shows up, and we have to show up for each other, whether it's the violence against the Asian community this year, or it's Vanessa Guillon, or George Floyd, or Breonna Taylor. We all have to show up for each other. These are not isolated amongst itself. We have to work together, and we have to build stronger bridges across our communities together too. But that's where it starts, is that we have to support each other, because this is a common issue. This is not isolated. Like I said, every year might be something different, or every few months, but it affects all of us. And we have to show up together. And that's where you started, Rudy, with allyship. And we have to work together. And looping back, when Virginia talks about courage, we need to know who's out there to support us too. And that's where allyship comes into play. As an elected leader, who's behind me? I don't want to be leading and look behind me and see no one behind me. So where are our allies? How can we work together? How can we build bridges across our communities and make our communities stronger together? I mean, that's what it really is all about.
Extending that ladder so people can come up with us, right?
Absolutely. I agree. And we need to bring them with us and lift them for those that need help, because that's what we owe people as leaders, is that we need to look back and grab a hand and bring them with us.
And it has to go beyond performative allyship, as you've brought up, Rudy. It's not enough. You know, put your money where your mouth is, because this is the time for courage. If you can't put your money where your mouth is, to me, you're not courageous and you're not a leader. This is the time where we all have to put our money where our mouths are, and we have to lead.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us and having this tough conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We look forward to more conversations with you in the future. I know we'll be doing hopefully a lot of good things in our communities. Thank you so much for your courage and for your leadership. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rudy. Thank you, Connie.
Thank you, and have a good night.
Good night, guys.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Adiós.
谢谢。
Gracias.